So thank you so much for attending the last lecture of this fall quarter. And I'm extraordinarily delighted to have the pleasure of welcoming my dear colleague, Antigone Zornazzi, the director of the Hellenics Research Center Foundation, and presently a Getty scholar who shall be introduced more properly by another dear colleague of mine, Dr. Jeffrey Spear, the former chief curator at the Getty Villa, and who has graced us with his presence as an associate researcher at the Institute presently. He shall, of course, be by far better able to introduce Dr. Zornazzi to us. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Spear to welcome Dr. Antigone Zornazzi. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rahim. As Professor Shagan said, my name is Jeffrey Spear. I was curator at the Getty Museum before my retirement, and then Professor Shagan kindly allows me to perch in the Port of Oud Institute, which I'm very grateful for. I know that, speaking for Professor Shagan, like myself, we're great admirers of Antigone Zornazzi, our speaker today. Yes, we are. I was fortunate to be able to host Dr. Zornazzi as a visiting scholar at the Getty in 2019, I believe it was, and selfishly made use of her considerable scholarly knowledge to help plan the Persia and the Classical World exhibition at the Getty, which was held in 2022. Demonstrating her versatility, I was again able to seek her advice for the recent exhibition on Thrace, for she has published the remarkable Thracian inscriptions from Azone in northern Greece. Dr. Zornazzi is Director of Research at the Institute of Historical Research of the National Hellenic Research Foundation in Athens. She's noted for her work on the interconnection between Greece and Persia, including the border areas such as Thrace and especially Cyprus. She's written on extensively. There's a wonderful clarity in her work, which I always enjoy, which is free of the many prejudices found in classical studies. She carefully explores the interactions occurring in the Achaemenid Empire and the complexities of identity and ethnicity by drawing out a wide range of sources, archaeological, epigraphic, and literary. Her present project extends this analysis to the end of the Sasanian period. There's a wonderful website continually updated and in preparation. It will be a very good resource for all of us. It is these Greek and Persian encounters in the time of the Achaemenid Empire that she will speak about this evening. So let's welcome Antigone Zornazzi.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you very much for the most generous introduction, which I don't know if I deserve, but it's a pleasure to be here and to be invited by the Purdabut and Purdabut Institute and Yarshatel Center to speak to you tonight. And my thanks for this quote to my dear colleague and friend Rahim Shayegan, and of course dear Marisa, I don't see. It's good to be back, and in fact, I would like to express my most grateful thanks to the Getty for their hospitality, which in fact has enabled me to be here with you tonight. Their hospitality as guest researcher. I have reaped benefits from being at the Getty in the past, and I have benefited enormously this time as well. So yes, it's good to be back. It's good to be back to see old friends and colleagues, and to make also some remarkably wonderful new friends staying at, working at the villa and staying at the Scholar House in this year. So thank you all very much. Ancient Greek encounters with Persia left lasting traces in the annals of world history in the form of the well-known Greek-Persian political and military antagonism, which was sealed by the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea, and later with the dissolution of the Achaemenid Empire by Alexander. Ancient Greek, and particularly Athenian political bias against the Achaemenid Empire, has significantly contributed to a modern perception of the historical relations between the Greeks and the Persians as a leading example of clash of civilizations and East-West political, cultural, and ideological distinctness and conflict. The idea that the Greek-Persian conflict transcended the boundaries of Greek and Persian activities can already be detected in the 5th century BC work of Herodotus. In a passage written decades after the unsuccessful expedition of Xerxes against the Greek mainland, Herodotus implies that the Greek-Persian encounters on the battlefield were tantamount to a more global conflict between Europe, which was associated with the Greeks, and Asia, which was dominated by the Persians. Today I would like to sketch in broad lines necessarily the historical context that has given rise to negative stereotypes about the Persians reflected in the Greek sources, but departing from the emphasis on rivalry, I would like to draw attention to evidence that speaks to a more nuanced picture of Greek responses to Persia and to intercultural phenomena that were promoted by the interactions between the Greeks and the Greek and the Persian world during the Late Archaic and the Classical period. In the span of a single generation, that of Cyrus II, the Great, the Persians succeeded first to liberate themselves from their Median overlords, and then to set out on a career of conquests that would make them masters of an empire which, at the time of its maximal extent under Darius I, stretched from the Indus Valley in the east to southeastern Europe and northern Africa in the west. The consequences of this phenomenal Persian expansion were felt in the Greek world as early as the 540s. Cyrus's takeover of the powerful Lydian kingdom of Chrysos opened the way to the conquest of the prosperous Greek cities of Asia Minor, on the coasts of Asia Minor. It may have also been responsible for the reported voluntary alignment of the largely Greek-speaking kingdoms of Cyprus with Cyrus. In 525 BC, the conquest of Egypt by Cambyses placed under Persian control the emporium of Nafkratis, the most important perhaps overseas center of Greek trade. Some 10 or 15 years later, the expedition of Darius against European Scythians and the immediately following campaign of the Persian general Megabazus in the northern Aegean and the Propontis led to the establishment of a Persian physical presence on European territory as well. By the end of the 6th century, Persian influence in Europe extended from the northern Aegean to seemingly the northern Black Sea coast and encompassed places on the Greek mainland further south than Thessaly, such as the commercially important island state of Aegina, and even for a brief spell of time, Athens. Persian rule on European territory was short-lived. It ended shortly after the failure of the great expedition of the son and successor of Darius I, Xerxes, in 480-79. A substantial part of the Greek world remained, however, under more or less direct Persian control in Asia Minor, Cyprus, and Egypt. The Greek-Persian military competition also acquired novel pragmatic and ideological aspects. In 480, threatened by the Persian advance, Sparta, Athens, and other Greek states had created a Hellenic League which successfully confronted Xerxes' troops at Salamis, Plataea, and Mycale. This military unification and its evolution in the aftermath of Xerxes' defeat into the Delian League under Athenian leadership set the stage for the emergence in the Aegean of a hegemonic power with claims, like Persia, to extended territorial control and in possession of a fleet that was capable of challenging the Persian power in both the Aegean and the southeastern Mediterranean. Greco-Persian competition would continue periodically in new theaters of war, in Asia Minor and the Aegean, Cyprus, the Syro-Palestinian coast, and Egypt for 150 years. From the Greek side, proper motivations for continuing the hostilities after the Persian Wars were variously a desire to repair the injuries the Greeks had suffered by laying waste the territory of the king, to seize from Persia the control of the sea, thalassocracy, and especially to liberate the Greek cities that still remained under Persian rule in the eastern Mediterranean. To judge by surviving texts of Greek-Persian territorial agreements, any Greek successes on the latter fronts proved to be temporary. Despite intermittent Greek interventions, the Persian kings largely remained in control of the Greek cities in Asia and Cyprus until the time of Alexander. By the time Herodotus was writing, the unification of the Greeks against the Persian threat also acquired expression through a new collective definition of a pan-Hellenic ethnocultural identity, a definition of Hellenism, to Hellenikon, as an entity that in its veins rolled the same blood, which spoke the same language, and had common centers of worship and sacrifices and like ways of life. This definition provided, on the one hand, cohesiveness among the formerly distinct as a rule regional, civic, ethnic, and tribal identities of the various Greek communities that were established along the breadth and extent of the Mediterranean world. Excuse me. At the same time, it served to emphasize the distinctness and opposition between the Hellenes and the barbarians, the latter term being, of course, used par excellence by the Greeks at the time for the Persians and the Achaemenid Empire, a distinctness that came to possess important ideological implications apart from the well-known political and military ones. In the ancient Greek sources, the Persians are variously seen with sympathy. I'm thinking in particular of the humane, respectful approach to the defeated Persians in the Persia of Aeschylus. They are seen with admiration, as in Xenophon's description of Cyrus the Great as a model statesman, but also with genuine curiosity on account of their different customs. In this case, I'm thinking, of course, of the extensive account of Persian customs in the work of Herodotus, of which we see some excerpts. At the same time, the distinctness of the two peoples from each other, which certainly applied in terms of, say, their different language, manner of clothing, burial customs, concepts of education, and even eating habits, is rendered by means of stereotypes that were shaped through the lens of the ongoing military and political competition of the Greek cities, and especially Athens, with the Persian Empire. These stereotypes stressed the greater valor of the Greeks over the Persians in the battlefield, the superiority of Greek civilization in relation to the Persian barbarian one, and the superiority of the Greek democratic institutions and political freedom against the totalitarian authority of the Persian kings. The passage from the Panegyrikos of the Athenian orator Isocrates offers a typical example of this mentality, which exaggerates the military weakness and obedience of the Persians because of their autocratic regime. One must keep in mind, of course, when one reads the Panegyrikos, which was delivered in 380 BC, that this is just a few years after the king's peace, which was a terrible blow on Athenian hegemonic plans. Given the negative Greek feelings against the Persian political system, at least the possibility of the adoption of Persian principles of government and Persian administrative mechanisms in the Greek world would seem extremely remote. This impression is weakened by indications of convergences between the Persian ways of governing on the one hand, and on the other hand, the practices of 5th century hegemonic Athens. In the imperial worldview expressed in the Achaemenid reliefs, in the Achaemenid texts, compulsory contributions constituted one of the three pillars of the harmonious coexistence of the empire's subjects with the Persian king, the other two pillars being these subjects' absolute obedience to the king's orders and respect for his law. In the reliefs of the great audience hall, the Apadana at Persepolis, the tangible economic benefits that derived from Persia's extended territorial rule are depicted in the form of valuable, prestigious, and exotic offerings presented to the Persian monarch by delegations of 23 separate subject peoples. Compared to the luxurious and prestigious offerings depicted in the reliefs, Herodotus describes a more mundane, but nonetheless highly profitable system of annual mandatory contributions or tribute. According to his report, the imperial subjects, organized for fiscal purposes into 20 separate jurisdictions, were annually liable to pay to Persian authorities tributes whose total value exceeded the amount of 14,000 euboic silver talents. The table in Greek presents a summary of the taxes per jurisdiction as recorded in Herodotus, with the sum total circled in red. If my calculations are correct, this total is equivalent to 364 tons of silver. The individual amounts were calculated on the basis of a systematic assessment of the local wealth in each case, for instance, by land measurement in Ionia. In 478-77, when the Hellenic alliance evolved into the Delian League, the institution of mandatory yearly contributions in manual worships by the member cities was, so far as we know, unprecedented in the terms of previous Greek alliances, in which individual contributions were determined on the basis of actual military needs. Today, a number of specialists incline to accept that the systematic establishment in the Delian League of compulsory annual contributions assessed as in the Persian Empire on the basis of the respective resources of each league member originated from the Persian tributary system, whose workings, to judge also by the detailed account of Herodotus, was well known to the Greeks. The instances on the slide highlight the basic similarities between Persian and Athenian tributary practices, and the key technical terms used in both instances, which are taxes, assessment, and phoros, tribute. The innovative character of the institution of phoros in the Delian League, with reference to practices of earlier Greek alliances, may also be alluded in the third passage, in the third passage, it is in red, by the felt need of Thucydides to explain what phoros means. Phoros, this is how they called this money contributed. And I wonder, but this might be something to discuss later, if there might be a connection between bara and phoros. Rahim, I don't know. Something to think about. Similarities between Achaemenid and 5th century Athenian hegemonic practices were apparently not confined to the domain of taxation. Virtually unknown in a Greek environment before the Persian expansion in the West, the confiscation of lands of defeated enemies and recalcitrant allies, and their assignment to Athenian colonists, the so-called klerouks, occurs as a feature of Athenian hegemonic practice. This method of civic and military control and economic exploitation, which was abhorrent to the allies of Athens, can be traced to a Persian practice also known to have been implemented in Greek subject areas. I remind you of the confiscation and redistribution of Milesian lands to Persians and Carians at the end of the Ionian Revolt. An additional point of convergences between Persian and Athenian methods of hegemonic control is implied by the establishment of Athenian commissioners, the episcopi, in the cities of Athens as allies. Testimonies about the activities of these Athenian episcopoi would allow direct comparison with the corresponding itinerant officials of the Persian Empire, whose functions are also rendered in the Greek text of Xenophon by the term episkopeo. The list of similarities that have been proposed between the Athenian and Persian hegemonic practices extends to issues of naval organization, emphasis on justice and the rule of law, and ceremonies with hegemonic ideological implications. In the latter case, one has noted the possible affinity between the Athenian ceremonial display of the phoroi, the tributes, collected from their allies during the great Athenian festival of the Dionysia, and the corresponding display of the contributions of Persian subjects to the great king in the Apadana reliefs. These and other instances, some pointed out by earlier scholars and collectively discussed by Kurt Rauflau, led the scholars to propose that with few exceptions, and leaving room for adaptations to Greek conditions and purposes, the entire range of Athenian instruments of empire was derived from Persian models. One may or may not concur with the conclusions drawn in different instances by Rauflau and others. The number and range of possible convergences would still imply, at the very least, that the dialogue between Persian and 5th century Athenian approaches to rule can no longer be ignored by students of the Athenian Empire. This dialogue would be further intensified with the ascendancy of Macedon to leadership in the Greek world and the eventual Macedonian inheritance of the Achaemenid imperial legacy at the time of Alexander. Such developments also serve to temper Isocrates' earlier fierce polemics against the type of monarchic outlook associated with Persia. Spoken about with disdain in his Panegyricos of 380 BC, even the notion of the more than human status of the Persian king is featured in the work of the same Attic orator some 40 years later as a positive inducement for launching a Pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia under Macedonian leadership. In a letter addressed to Philip II, Alexander's father, Isocrates effectively urges this Macedonian king to aspire to the putative, quasi-divine status of Achaemenid monarchs by compelling the barbarians to be serfs of the Greeks, and by forcing the king, who is now called Great, to do whatever Philip commanded, for then ουδέν λοιπόν έτι πληνθόν γενέστε, for then will not be left for you except to become a god. The impact of the Greek-Persian dialogue in the domain of political ideas and practices was not one-sided. Even though they were incongruous with Persia's autocratic outlook, Greek democratic values also acquired a place in the Persian political perspective. In the late 490s, a year after the Persian suppression of the revolt of the Ionians against Persia, the Persian general Mardonius sailed, we are told, with a Persian fleet from Cilicia to the Aegean, and upon arriving in Ionia, he abolished the former tyrannical regimes and established democratic governments in the Ionian cities. Herodotus brings this up, this inter-Persian intervention up, as evidence for the truthfulness of another Persian episode he relates in his narrative, and which, as he states, the Greeks refused to believe. This other episode is set at a time of political crisis in Persia, following the death of the last legitimate successor of Cyrus the Great, and during a time, this time is around 520 BC, when the claim of the next Persian ruler, Darius I, on the throne was not yet secure. As Herodotus relates, attempts to resolve the crisis comprised a debate among no less than 7 contenders for the Persian throne, Darius included, about the kind of political constitution that it would be most beneficial for the Persians to adopt. In the debate, arguments were presented by different speakers respectively for and against the adoption of a democratic, an oligarchic, and a monarchic regime. We see some of the arguments made by the Persian Otanis in favor of democracy. The position that prevailed in the end was that of Darius, in favor of the maintenance of Persia's monarchic regime. Darius's official account of the circumstances of his accession on the throne, recorded in the inscriptions of his monument at Bisotun in northwestern Iran, differ substantially from the report of Herodotus, and the origin of Herodotus's information in this instance is unknown. The reality of the idea expressed by Herodotus, namely that the value of the monarchic regime of Persia was disputed by the Persians, may be put to doubt. As Herodotus' work was addressed to a Greek audience, one could surmise that the various arguments put forward during the Persian debate for and against democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy reflected instead Greek political experiences and emanated from Greek rather than Persian political discourse. Or, Herodotus' testimony in this instance could be alluding to an important aspect of Persian political behavior, namely the ongoing dialogue between the Persian worldview and the political ideas of Persia's subjects, for which clear evidence is provided by official Persian works. In the inscription of his famous cylinder found in Babylon and addressed to the Babylonian people, Cyrus, a foreign conqueror of Mesopotamia, is represented according to the requirements of the Babylonian tradition as having been chosen by Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. Simultaneously, his representation as king of the universe, the great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, and so on, combined elements of royal titulary that were variously associated with different hegemonic states that had sprung in Mesopotamia in the course of the preceding millennia. The more than life-size statue of Darius excavated at Susa was manufactured in Egypt and stood originally, perhaps, in an Egyptian temple. The head and a part of the upper body are missing. The remainder of the statue depicts Darius as a stereotypical Persian king. In common with representations of Persian royalty in Achaemenid reliefs, coins, and seals, the king is shown in the pleated ceremonial Persian robe with wide sleeves and possesses a short dagger, here placed in a scabbard with scalloped edge. In the trilingual cuneiform text carved down the pleats on the right side of the robe, the invocations of Darius's Iranian patron deity Ahura Mazda, the proud proclamation that the Persian man has conquered Egypt, and Darius's dynastic credentials as a great king, king of kings, king of countries, son of Hystaspes and Achaemenian, all echo faithfully the tenor of known inscriptions of Darius in the Persian homeland. The work as a whole displays, however, a mixture of Persian and Egyptian elements. Such Egyptian elements are the expression of Darius's name in Egyptian fashion in a cartouche with hieroglyphic signs, and in the hieroglyphic inscriptions and motifs presented in the base of the statue. There are no references in the hieroglyphic text to Darius's Persian identity, let alone to a Persian domination of Egypt. And even Darius's elsewhere consistent association with the chief Iranian deity Ahura Mazda is here replaced by references to his divine affiliation with Atum and Re, divine patrons par excellence of Egyptian kings. These official representations of Cyrus and Darius allow us to visualize a larger framework of Persian political behavior that placed an emphasis on the Persians' acquisition of knowledge about the native political institutions of the different peoples with whom conquest had brought them into contact. It also allows us to visualize a readiness on the part of the Persians to engage this knowledge in promoting and maintaining a political equilibrium in the different territories over which they ruled, by paying heed to different local political expectations. This same framework may be held to validate both the reality of Macedonius' establishment of democracies in Ionia in place of tyrannies, in keeping with Ionian political preferences, and the Persian rhetorical ability in comparing different types of constitutions, as implied by the alleged Persian political debate recounted by Herodotus. Turning from the domain of political institutions and ideas to material culture, further vivid insights into the Greek-Persian dialogue are offered by archaeological finds. The examples to be considered here come from the Persian homeland and from European territory. In the capitals of the Achaemenid rulers in Iran, such references are possible to detect since the earliest moments of Persian westward expansion. They are manifest in the monumental building program undertaken by Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae in the wake of his conquest of the Lydian kingdom and the coastal cities of Asia Minor in the 540s. In the architecture of Cyrus, pride of place is given to a type of hypostyle hall that had an earlier history in Iran. It formed, as we can see, the kernel of the palaces and pavilions arranged around the royal garden. In the examples of this Iranian building type, the earlier Iranian construction in plinths and wooden columns is redefined by means of the addition of hypostyle porticos, which have been suggested to echo the plans of peripteral Greek temples, and as commonly in the architecture of Cyrus, by an extensive use of stone, which was worked moreover with techniques that were previously unknown in Iran and often point to Western Asia Minor. Although it is not as pronounced as it is in Pasargadae, the Greek element is nonetheless equally present in the classical expressions of Persian monumental architecture and art as they evolved during the reign of Darius. The eastern identity of the monument, the rock-cut victory monument of Darius on the steep southern face of Mount Bisotun, is evidenced by the trilingual cuneiform inscriptions in Elamite, Old Persian, and Babylonian that were carved on the smooth face of the rock to the left, right, and below Darius's relief, and within the sculptured panel. The iconographic motifs that compose the image of Darius's victory against his adversaries equally look back to Eastern prototypes, and so do a number of the details of the physiognomy of the Persian king. The plastic rendering of the royal robe, with vertical pleats on the front and stacked diagonal folds with zigzag edges on the back of the figure, has no precedence in Eastern art. Its closest parallels are found in Greek sculpture and vase painting of the Late Archaic period. In the royal complex built by Darius and his successors at Persepolis, on a lower terrace of the Kubi Rahmat, the eye is instantly captivated by the presence of the Iranian column hall, the monumental doorways with cavato cornices inspired from Egyptian architecture, and the colossal apotropaic figures are familiar from earlier Assyrian palaces. Here as well, the contribution of traditions of West Asia Minor is signaled by stoneworking techniques, by the ionic fluting of the slender columns which soared up to a height of 22 meters with their composite capitals, and not least by the smooth carving and stylization of the draperies of sculpted figures. The figures of Lydians in the middle are from the tribute reliefs of the Apadana. The curved lines rendering their chitons evidence a stylization attested in Greek sculpture and vase painting of the Late Archaic period, as in the reliefs of the Sivnian treasury at Delphi. The presence of such Western elements may not be understood merely as the result of emulation of foreign originals by native craftsmen. They speak to an active engagement, at least at an initial formative stage, of craftsman trade in the stoneworking and construction practices of Western Asia Minor, and explicit references to the engagement of Greek and Lydian specialized craftsmen in the Persian rulers' monumental projects are offered by an inscription of Darius that describes the construction of his palace at Susa, to which we will return shortly. Searches for the origins of the various elements that are attested in the imperially created forms of Achaemenid monumental architecture and art have occupied for long the attention of specialists in classical and Near Eastern archaeology and art, and the explorations are still ongoing. For a time, the evidence for the Greek contribution was seen to allow even the most maximalist assessments of Greek input in the formation of Achaemenid monumental expressions. The most extreme formulation of this viewpoint was Gisela Richter's discussion of Achaemenid art as a peripheral province of the Greek artistic world, as more or less a Greek art where a certain foreign element is noticeable. Today, thanks to a number of important works, we are in a better position to appreciate the motivation for the presence of the Greek and other foreign elements in the Achaemenid monumental expressions. On one hand, there was a desire of the Persian king to create, in the lack of a suitable, of course, earlier Near Eastern monumental tradition, a physical setting for the royalty that matched the splendor of those of earlier monarchs, Mesopotamia, Lydia, Egypt, whom they succeeded to power. The eclectic synthesis of elements coming from different traditions would have been meant simultaneously to convey the idea of the Persian king's extended territorial rule in keeping with earlier Eastern practices and rhetoric. An inscription dated about a century and a half before the reign of Cyrus commemorates the planning and construction on virgin soil of the royal capital city and the private palace of the Neo-Assyrian ruler Sargon II at the site of present-day Khorsabad in northern Iraq. The inscription refers to the valuable materials employed for the construction of Dur Sharuken, among them cedars from Lebanon, but also to an addition to the plan of the palace of a type of propylon, a type of portico, which originated, as the text indicates, from Hittite palace architecture and was called Bit Hilani in the Amorite language. In the late 8th century, when the royal city and palace of Sargon were built, the region of origin of both the cedars and the Bit Hilani were counted as part of the Assyrian Empire of Cyrus. The description of the construction of Cyrus' city and palaces as the work of the inhabitants of the regions that Sargon had conquered and who were under his yoke leaves no room for doubting that the use of Lebanon cedars and the addition of the Bit Hilani of the so-called Hittite origin were both meant to echo the expansion of the Assyrians in the west. A similar picture of extended dominion, this time that of Persia, emerges from the earlier mentioned inscription of Darius I, which describes the construction of his palace at Susa. Laying the palace's massive foundations was the work, we are told, accomplished by the Babylonians, who also manufactured in molds the vast quantities of bricks for the walls of the palace. Next, the inscription mentions the origins of the prestigious materials used for the construction and decoration of Darius' Susa residence. These are helpfully marked on the map of Michael Rowe, and the different ethnic groups that undertook, based undoubtedly on their respective skills, the transportation and working of these materials. The catalogue includes precious aromatic cedar from Lebanon, shisham wood, the so-called Indian rosewood from Gandhara and from Kerman, where this, I understand, is still native, and so on and so forth. Gold from Lydia and Bactria, lapis lazuli and carnelian from Sogdiana, turquoise from Khorasmi, and so on. All these regions that the Persians had conquered. The same holds true of the different groups of workmen who, according to the statements of Darius, handled the transportation of these materials from their distant places of origin and accomplished the various tasks that the building of the palace entailed. Babylonians, Assyrians, Carians, Ionians, Lydians, Medes, Egyptians, and others who carried out the foundation works, built the palace's brick walls, worked the gold, silver, and ebony, and decorated the surfaces of the walls. All these were conquered subjects of the Persians. As in the case of Sargon's inscription from Khorsabad, the purpose of the description of the construction of Darius's palace at Susa was not just to provide a matter-of-fact catalogue of construction materials and work tasks, but to make a statement of imperial power through mention of the prestigious materials and human resources that were placed under the control of this Persian king, owing to the Persians' far and wide-ranging conquests. The Greek elements that are attested in Achaemenid monumental works, elements that were once even thought on occasion to define these Achaemenid creations as provincial expressions of Greek art, certainly imply Achaemenid appreciation for the aesthetics and technical skills of Greek craftsmen, builders, stonecutters, sculptors. Inasmuch as the main client of these works was the Persian king, however, and seen from his ideological perspective, these Greek elements would have been primarily meant to express Persian pride for the conquest of the West by the Persian man whose spear, as Darius states in his funerary inscription, had gone forth far. The contributions of all the foreign traditions detected to Persian architecture and sculpture would constitute a visual expression of the Persian conquest of the Ecumeni. 5th century Athenian perceptions were apparently not impervious to this Achaemenid and earlier Near Eastern imperial perspective. One may recall the close interconnections between hegemony and privileged access to everything from all parts of the world that is drawn into Thucydides. The excerpt is from the funeral orations, and it is attributed to the leading 5th century Athenian statesman Pericles. The whole speech, of course, was a praise for the greatness of hegemonic Athens. Achaemenid material culture equally had the potential to influence the practices and works of the peoples who inhabited the territory and along the borders of the empire. The diffusion to the west of forms, motif, and stylistic elements that were characteristic of the Achaemenid material culture was partly due to works that were circulated or manufactured in the Eastern Mediterranean space on official Achaemenid initiative. Typical examples are the royal coins depicting variations of the armed figure of the Persian king, which have been found in a number of hoards, but also official monuments. One such example is the Egyptian-made statue of Darius we saw earlier. A further textually attested instance is provided by the two stelae which, according to Herodotus, Darius I erected on his Bosporus bridgeheads during his campaign against the European Scythians. These stelae, said to have been inscribed respectively in Greek and Assyrian characters, I believe Assyrian characters in this case is not Aramaic but trilingual cuneiform, because we are dealing with an official monument. So these stelae have not survived. They probably included pictorial elements like the ones erected by the same monarch in Egypt in order to commemorate his reopening or completion of the Suez Canal, and we see one of Darius' Suez Canal stelae below on the left. To official Achaemenid initiative, one might further attribute a presumably locally made, enigmatic sculpted slab, which is said to have been found at the Hill of the Muses in Athens. It is now exhibited in the National Archaeological Museum. The slab is decorated with reliefs in two registers. The upper register depicts the so-called motif of the royal hero as master of animals, holding two rampant winged horned creatures by the horn. The lower register is an animal combat, a lion with frontal head devouring a stag. The composition as a whole does not easily lend itself to an interpretation as a product of Athenian civic, private, or artistic inspiration. David Bivar compared both images with motifs of official Achaemenid seals, and as in the cases of those seals, the two emblematic motifs of the sculpted registers possibly allude to a monument which followed official Achaemenid specifications and conveyed the message of the Achaemenid authorities. A very intriguing monument. In European Greece, where the Persian presence was short-lived, principal ways of transmission of Persian cultural elements would have been, as Margaret Miller has also pointed out, through direct observation of Persians during Persian expeditions on Greek territory and Greek expeditions in the Persian-controlled East, visits to royal and satrapal centers by members of Greek embassies, diplomatic gifts dispensed by the Persians, the acquisition of objects of Achaemenid types through trade, and especially as spoils from victorious Greek expeditions. An idea about the variety and wealth of such spoils can be obtained from Herodotus' description of the valuable jewelry, bracelets and torques, vessels, golden craters, fiale and cups, items of military armament and textiles seized by the Persians from the cup of the defeated Persians, seized by the Greeks, from the cup of the defeated Persians after the Battle of Plataea. The most valuable of these objects was reportedly the dagger, the Akinakis, of the Persian commander at Plataea, Mardonius, said to have been dedicated on the Athenian Acropolis. According to the Athenian orator Demosthenes, it weighed 300 darics, or approximately 2.5 kilograms. Of the numerous precious vessels, jewelry, and other valuable artifacts of Achaemenid types that ended up in various ways or were manufactured in Balkan territory, only few examples survive today. They come mainly from the interior and the coastal regions of Thrace. The most notable example is a silver-gilt amphora rhyton, which with handles in the form of fantastic animals, found at Douvanli in the interior of Thrace. The precious tableware occasionally marked with Greek inscriptions, possibly but not necessarily indicating that it could have also been manufactured by Greek craftsmen. The wider appeal of forms of Achaemenid luxury culture may be mainly surmised from Greek and in particular Attic workshops' adaptations of different types of Achaemenid metalware in precious metal or glass, in the more mundane medium of clay, and it is the products of the Attic workshops which also provide the most eloquent surviving pictorial testimony about mainland Greek perceptions of and responses to Persia. Following the Persian Wars, characteristic elements of Persian clothing and armament, which the Greeks had ample opportunity to observe at close quarters during military conflicts, invade Attic vase painting in connection with a new iconographic repertoire. The subject of this repertoire, sometimes inspired by the military confrontations of Greeks and Persians, at other times the scenes painted on the vases record Persian themes, or throw light on mocking Greek approaches to the Persians, or showcase the introduction of elements proper to Persian lifestyle and ceremony by members of the Greek social reality, and also by characters of Greek myth. And I would like to conclude this talk with a few examples from this repertory, whose treatment we largely owe to a series of studies by Margaret Miller. In scenes of combat, characteristic elements of Persian military equipment and clothing are the folded head covering, which Herodotus refers to as tiara, the anaxirides, the trousers, the rectangular shields, which Herodotus calls gera, and which are also depicted on Achaemenid reliefs. In one instance, additional confirmation of a fighter's Persian identity is provided by the surviving initial letters of his name, Artova, a name whose first component element, urta, rightness, was common in Persian and Iranian onomastics. As far as artistic choices were concerned, the exotic from the Greek viewpoint Oriental motif of the Persian would have been favored, among other things, on account of its decorative potential. The emphasis on Persian subjects would have simultaneously offered the Attic vase painters an opportunity to add a significant political and ideological dimension to their compositions. Scenes of combat, the most common theme of reference to Persia in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, and a theme that would have had especially appealed to the proud sentiments of a clientele of Greek war veterans, usually refers us to the political stereotype of Greek military superiority over the Persians. This stereotype is expressed through images of Persians in the role of the Greeks' defeated opponents, fallen in their feet, or retreating to avoid the onslaught of the Greek hoplites. The overall impression that one forms from the extant Attic depictions of Persian subjects is that their details could be variously affected by Persian realities, contemporary Greek perceptions and artistic trends, and in at least one instance, possibly to conjure by costume restrictions of performances of Attic tragedy. On this Attic inochoi, the two figures on the left are labeled respectively Vasilevs and Vasilis, king and queen. Ernst Buschor referred the representation as a whole to the necromancy scene in the Persia of Aeschylus, interpreting the three figures from left to right as Atossa, the mother of Xerxes, the epiphany of Xerxes' deceased father, Darius I, and Atossa's attendants. If Buschor's interpretation is considered opposite, the combination of two distinct types of Persian clothing, the trouser costume and the chiton, alluding to the opulent Persian robe in this instance, was probably intended to clarify the private identity of the male royal figure in the scene painted on the vase, and perhaps also the theatrical stage. In other peaceful contexts, depicting instances from real life or myth, details of Persian costume and ceremonial suggest the adoption of elements of Persian lifestyle in a Greek environment. Such elements are the kandis, here worn by the Amazon Andromeda, and the parasol, which is held by a lady on an Attic fragment. On the scene of an inochoi of the 5th century BC, the symbolic vocabulary of Achaemenid imperial iconography is turned against the Persians themselves. In a Persian environment, as is in the Persepolis relief on the left, the motif of a lion shown with a frontal head attacking a bull was emblematic of Persian imperial power and military might. On the Attic inochoi, the same motif is employed in a Scoptic sense as an allusion to Persian defeat. An Achaemenid-looking lion with a frontal head devours the horse of a Persian who is fleeing on foot. The final example, on a rhiton in the form of Amazon signed by the Attic potter Sotadis, was found at Meroe. It aligns with the Persian view on the outcome of the Greek-Persian conflict, overturning the iconographic stereotype of Greek victory over the Persians. The depiction of a Persian-clad horseman defeating a Greek hoplite refers us to ideological concessions of Attic vase painters to the requirements of a Persian or Persophile clientele. It reminds us that the Greek-Persian dialogue and Greek-Persian approaches to Persia also need to be viewed through the lens of the occasional priority that the ancient Athenians and the other Greeks, or for that matter the Persians too, were ready to cede to more pragmatic concerns over political and cultural sensitivities and emotions, as it often happens in real life. Thank you.